China sees Africa as a place of opportunity, while the United States has historically seen Africa as a problem that needs to be solved. This is what's happening because this one sentence best captures the divergent approaches that China and the United States have taken toward Africa. 10 years have passed since China started the vast Belt and Road Initiative, which has attracted 149 nations worldwide, 49 of which are in Africa. For the US government, this is currently a big concern. Equipped with some of the most valuable commodities, minerals, and resources on the planet, Africa is among the richest continents. Africa has long been of strategic importance to the United States, but this interest has always been in the continent's resources rather than the future advancement of the African people. In this video, I'll go over some of the mistakes the United States has made and explain why a lot of African nations are now turning to China for economic growth. Let's also highlight a few of China's groundbreaking Belt and Road initiatives that have transformed Africa's future. China's arrival in Africa brought significant changes that are easy to see, like 100,000 kilometers of roads, 10,000 kilometers of railways, over 1,000 bridges, 100 ports, and numerous hospitals and schools. These real changes have made lots of Africans to view China differently. These projects give hope to future generations and offer ways for living a better quality of life. Instead of investing in similar projects in Africa, the US government has resorted mainly in lecturing and warning African leaders about the risks of working with China, in hopes that the US can somehow reverse the trend of Chinese investment into Africa. This approach comes across as very disrespectful to African nations, because it assumes their leaders don't know what's best for their countries. As Macky Sall, the president of the African Union, recently said, "When we talk, we're often not listened to, or at least not with enough interest. This is what we want to change, and let no one tell us, no, don't work with so-and-so, just work with us. We want to work and trade with everyone." China was hardly present in Africa 20 years ago, while the United States dominated trade there. Chinese leaders didn't sit down and strategize on how to stop the United States in Africa. China simply launched its own plans to grab their market share. Fast forward to today, and China is clearly winning the race. China's trade with Africa was almost 5 times larger than that of the United States in 2022, totaling $261 billion. However, a more significant statistic that demonstrates just how successful China's mission in Africa has been is a recent survey that found 77% of African youth think China is their country's most important future partner. So, how did America end up second in Africa? It all boils down to one simple mistake in its foreign policy. The US government often treats smaller, developing nations with disdain. Allow me to clarify. When it comes to engaging with Africa, the United States fails to address each nation separately and instead treats the continent as a whole. China treats each African nation separately when interacting with it, showing respect and providing an opportunity for each nation to communicate to China its unique needs and concerns. One of the main concerns with US foreign policy is its disrespect, as Zimbabwean diplomats said. The disdain for Africans is actually the reason why successful engagement with the continent has failed. That is the source of the issue. The United States is always in charge of establishing the policies, the agenda, and informing the Africans of the policies. There can be no meaningful engagement in that way. Joe Biden hosted the US-Africa Leaders Summit in December of last year in Washington, D.C., and welcomed 49 heads of state from Africa. Once again, the main objective of the summit was to convince African leaders the United States is a better trading partner than China. Again, notice the American mistake here. Instead of focusing on their own investments and genuinely wanting to help the people of Africa, the entire goal of the summit was to convince African leaders that America is good and China is bad. Ultimately, it left very few Africans feeling any confidence moving forward. Since it's a one-sided conversation, nothing will come of it. Thus, the fact that it is a one-sided discussion means that it will be another pointless meeting with no results. The reason this is happening is because there is a disrespect for the Africans. There is a general feeling that America doesn't need to hear from the Africans. Their opinions do not matter. Why does the US believe that it can interact with African leaders without a predetermined agenda? Once again, the US government set the agenda, set the policies, and informed the African leaders to follow America's plan without listening to the needs and want of African leaders. How can any meaningful change be made? Unfortunately, the US-Africa summit was a complete waste of time and will result in no change. We know this to be true because this is the exact same thing that happened in 2014 when President Obama hosted his own version of the US-Africa Leaders Summit. 8 years later, and the US still hasn't learned how to correctly treat Africans. The United States must understand that Africans are not going to take it anymore. If you don't treat the Africans fairly, the United States is going to see itself slowly losing ground to China, to Russia, to all other nations, because without respecting the Africans, without treating the Africans as equal, without understanding that exploitation and abuse of Africa simply cannot continue. Now that we've established the reason behind China overtaking the US, let's shift our focus to highlighting some of the key infrastructure projects that China has built and how these projects have shaped many Africans' perceptions of China. Let's start with the 760-kilometer Addis Ababa Djibouti Railway, which connects the capitals of Ethiopia and Djibouti. France was the first country to build a railway between these two countries and did so over 100 years ago. However, the railway had already ceased operation for over 10 years before China came in to rebuild it. Completed in 2016, the new railway has quickly become one of the most important infrastructure projects in the Horn of Africa region. And according to this article, from the Ethiopia Monitor, has increased its contribution to Ethiopia's import and export trade by 15%, recording revenues of US $47 million in the first 6 months of its most recent fiscal year. Earlier I mentioned, China has constructed over 1,000 bridges in Africa. One of the most impressive is the Maputo Katempe Bridge in Mozambique, the longest suspension bridge in Africa, spanning over 3,000 meters. The vision to create this bridge started in 1989 when the World Bank produced an urbanization plan for Maputo, the capital city of Mozambique. The project was held off until 2008, when Portugal expressed interest in funding this project. However, the 2008 global financial crisis ultimately led to Portugal withdrawing from the project and opening the pathway for China to finally deliver this much-needed bridge. China broke ground in 2014 and completed the bridge in 2018 for a cost of US $726 million, immediately helping the 2.5 million residents who live in the immediate vicinity of the bridge. China was able to rise from one of the top 10 poorest countries in the world some 50 years ago to now being the world's second-largest economy. One can only hope that Africa and its 54 nations can follow in the footsteps of China and achieve some of the economic prosperity and ultimately have a better quality of life. In conclusion, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into why China is now Africa's leading trading partner and why it will remain a key economic partner for the future. I believe the days of funding mega projects like this $3.6 billion railway in Kenya are over. As the Belt and Road Initiative evolves, I think China will be more subjective with its spending and look to finance smaller and more sustainable projects. In addition, as China is the world's largest producer of renewable energy, I foresee China focusing its efforts on building more sustainable and green projects around. As always, drop me a comment, hit that subscribe button, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next video.